A single ship, no escort, no warning, and it flew straight at the most heavily defended fortress in the galaxy as if it owned the sky. Fortress Orin had never fallen. In 11,000 years of recorded history, no fleet, no rebellion, no rogue empire had ever breached its shell. It was a crown jewel of the Galactic Conclave, a defensive ring built from the combined engineering of 47 member civilizations, bristling with particle cannons, layered shield generators, and a garrison numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Admiral Threx Kale, a veteran of 3 border wars, liked to tell young officers that Orin's greatest weapon wasn't its guns. It was a simple, unshakable fact of its existence. No one attacked what could not be beaten. No one had ever tried. That certainty cracked at 0347 station time, when a lone contact bled out of hyperspace at the edge of the fortress's outer sensor net. The ship was small by Conclave standards, barely 900 meters, dwarfed by the kilometers-long capital vessels docked at Orin's rings. Its hull was a patchwork of mismatched plating, scorched along one flank, stitched together with weld seams that told a story of battles fought somewhere far from here. No insignia, no fleet markings, just a name stenciled near the bow in characters a translation algorithm struggled to parse. Last promise. Species identification? Threx asked, leaning over the tactical display. Human, his aide answered, and something in her voice made the bridge crew go quiet. Confirmed human vessel. Registry unknown. It's not military grade by their fleet standards. Sensor profile suggests this is converted transport heavily modified. Threx almost laughed. Humanity was a young species, barely 2 centuries into interstellar travel, tolerated at the edges of conclave space more out of curiosity than respect. Their fleets were small, their technology inconsistent, brilliant in places, crude in others, and they had never, not once, initiated contact with a fortress world. That a single one of their ships, and not even a proper warship, had come alone to Orin should have been almost comical. It would have been, if not for what happened next. The last promise did not slow down for the mandatory identification checkpoint. It did not respond to the automated hailing frequencies. It simply kept coming, correcting its vector with a precision that made the helm officers frown. Every burn calculated, every course adjustment exactly as efficient as it needed to be, and not a fraction more. This was not a ship blundering into danger. This was a ship that already knew exactly where it was going. Order to halt, Threx said, the first note of unease creeping into his voice. Full stop, or we open fire. The reply came a full 90 seconds later, transmitted in flawless conclave trade tongue, spoken by a voice that was calm in a way that unsettled everyone who heard it. There was no fury in it, no desperation, just quiet, absolute resolve. This is Captain Elena Voss of the Terran vessel Last Promise. You are holding 17 human citizens in your detention sector. We are here to bring them home. Release them, and we will leave peacefully. This is the only offer you'll receive. For 3 seconds, no one on the bridge spoke. Then Threx did laugh, a short, disbelieving bark. One ship, he said, turning to his officers. One ship, demanding the release of prisoners from the most fortified station in Conclave history, as though we were some border customs post to be bullied. He shook his head. Send the standard response. Ignore this, and prepare a boarding party to seize that ship the moment it comes within range. We'll teach these humans the cost of arrogance. The message went out. The last promise did not answer. It did not turn away, either. It kept coming. What Threx did not know, what none of the 47 civilizations watching through Orin's countless sensor feeds knew, was the story of the 17 humans in that detention sector. They were a survey and diplomatic team, a mix of scientists, translators, and 2 off-duty Marines assigned as escort who had wandered too close to a disputed border moon 8 months earlier. A conclave patrol, jumpy after a string of pirate raids in the sector, had opened fire first and asked questions never. The human shuttle had been crippled, boarded, and its crew hauled to Orin as suspected hostile agents, a designation that had never been formally reviewed, because no one in the conclave bureaucracy had believed anyone would come looking. They were wrong. Someone had come looking. It had simply taken time to find them, and longer still to decide exactly how this would be done. because Elena Voss had not brought a war fleet, and everyone aboard the Last Promise understood exactly why. A war fleet would take months to assemble, would provoke a war that could kill millions on both sides, and might not even guarantee the 17 survived crossfire. Voss had not come to punish an empire. She had come to extract 17 people, cleanly, without a shot wasted on anything but that goal, and to be gone again before the Conclave fully understood what had happened to them aboard the fortress. Threx ordered the boarding craft prepped and the outer shield grid raised to maximum. 47 civilizations worth of military doctrine said that overwhelming force answered every threat, that numbers and firepower were the only currency that mattered in the dark between stars. He was about to learn that he was reading the wrong equation entirely. As the Last Promise crossed the boundary into Orin's engagement zone, its running lights dimmed, and its weapon systems. Every scanner on the station confirmed this, and every scanner would later be double-checked out of disbelief. Powered down to standby. It was not coming to fight. Threx stared at the readout, the first real chill of unease finally settling into his chest, and for the first time in his career as a Conclave Admiral, he found himself wondering if he had already lost, and simply didn't yet understand how. The battle for Fortress Orin Sol, not its walls, not its guns, but the very story the galaxy would tell about the day a single human ship arrived, was about to begin. 47 civilizations mobilized their finest doctrine against one ship, and the ship's captain hadn't even raised her voice yet. Word of the human vessel spread to the Conclave's command network faster than any official report could travel. By the time the sun cycle turned on Orin Station, representatives from a dozen member worlds had patched into the emergency channel, each demanding updates, each certain their own species' military theory would explain what was unfolding. The Drenari war clans argued for immediate annihilation. The Osirian Trade Council insisted on negotiation, worried about the commercial fallout of a diplomatic incident. The Velk, ancient and cautious, said nothing at all, and in their silence, something closer to real fear. Threx Kale found himself the reluctant center of a debate he had no patience for. His duty was simple: defend the fortress. Every instinct in his 30-year career told him the correct response to a single unescorted vessel was overwhelming force, applied swiftly before the situation could spiral into something the diplomats would regret. He gave the order. 60 interceptor craft launched from Orin's flight bays in a precise, practice formation, arranged to encircle the Last Promise and box it in against the fortress's outer hull, where its own defensive turrets could finish the job if the interceptors failed. It was a maneuver Threx had drilled 100 times in simulation. It had never once failed to trap a target ship. It failed in under 4 minutes. The Last Promise did not attempt to flee, which was the first sign that something was deeply wrong with Threx's assumptions. Instead, it executed a series of micro-burns so tight, so precisely timed to the gaps between the interceptor squadron's patrol vectors, that it slipped through the encirclement like water through a closing fist. No shots fired. No weapons even armed. By the time the interceptor wing recalculated its formation, the human ship had already closed a point-blank range on Orin's primary communications relay and disabled it with single, surgical bursts that took out the relay's targeting feed without so much as scratching the surrounding hull plating. On the bridge, a young tactical officer named Sarah Elam stared at the readout with something between horror and admiration. "That wasn't luck," she said quietly. "That was rehearsed. They knew our formation before we even launched it." "Impossible," Threx snapped. "Our patrol patterns are classified." But Sarah's already pulling up the data, and what she found made her blood run cold. The Last Promise's course corrections weren't reactive. They were predictive, built on a model of Orin's defenses that was more accurate than the model most of Threx's own junior officers carried in their heads. Somehow, someone aboard that ship had studied Fortress Orin more thoroughly than the fortress had ever studied itself. That was the first turning point. The moment the Conclave realized this was not an act of desperation, but the execution of a plan built with more care than any assault in Orin's long history. The second came 20 minutes later, when Threx, humiliated and furious, ordered every remaining defense system online and demanded a full station-wide lockdown, sealing every airlock, every transit tube, every possible route to the detention sector where the 17 humans were held. It was a correct doctrinal response. It should have bought hours, maybe days, for a proper counterassault to be organized. It bought less than 6 minutes. Because while every eye on the bridge, every sensor array, every interceptor pilot had been fixated on the last promise itself, no one had accounted for what the ship had already released before it ever entered engagement range. 3 small, nearly invisible drop pods, stealth-coated and silent, that had attached during the ship's earlier evasive maneuvers and drifted, engines cold, toward one of Orin's less monitored maintenance airlocks on the station's dark side. By the time station security flagged the breach, 6 armor humans were already inside. Threx stared at the internal sensor feed, watching red intrusion icons bloom across a deck plan he had once been proud to call impenetrable, and felt something he had not felt in decades of service. The particular, sinking dread of a commander who understands all at once that he has been outthought. "Recall the interceptors," he said, voice tight. "Get every available unit to the detention sector. Now." But even as the order left his mouth, he understood it might already be too late. And worse, watching the calm, methodical way the human ship continued to hold position outside the fortress, weapons still powered down, he understood something even more unsettling. The last promise wasn't the main threat. It had never been the main threat. It was cover, a magnificent, maddening distraction, drawing every eye on the fortress toward the sky, while the real mission unfolded in the dark corridors beneath their feet. The third turning point arrived in the form of a single message, relayed not to Bridge, but broadcast on an open emergency channel for every conclave officer on the station to hear. It was Elena Voss's voice again, still calm, still without a trace of anger, delivering words that would be repeated in military academies across 47 worlds for generations to come. "You're wondering why we didn't bring more ships. We didn't need more ships. We needed the right 6 people, and 17 reasons to bring them home. Stand down your interior forces, and no one else has to get hurt today." Threx looked around his bridge, at the flashing intrusion alerts, at the disabled communications relay, at the interceptor wing still scrambling to reform after being outmaneuvered by a single unarmed vessel, and for the first time allowed himself to wonder exactly what kind of people he was truly facing. He was about to find out. Deep in Orin's lower decks, the rescue had already begun. 6 humans, thousands of guards, and a rescue plan so precise it left no room for anything but perfect execution. The maintenance corridor smelled of ozone and recycled air, lit by the sickly amber glow of emergency lighting that had kicked in the moment the station-wide lockdown triggered. Sergeant Marcus Cole presses back against a support strut, counting heartbeats, listening to the distant thud of boots on metal grating growing louder down the connecting passage. Behind him, 5 other figures in matte black armor moved with the unhurried economy of people who had rehearsed this 100 times in simulation and knew exactly how many seconds they had to spare. "Contact in 10, came the voice in Cole's earpiece. Lieutenant Prion, house eyes on the drone feed from 3 decks up. 6 guards, standard patrol pattern. They haven't flagged us yet. Copy. Hold position." Cole raised a fist, and the team froze as one. This was the part of the mission that made the difference between a rescue and a massacre, and everyone in the squad understood it without needing to be told. They were not here to fight the Conclave. They were here to get 17 people out alive, and every single choice from this point forward will be measured against that single, unforgiving standard. No unnecessary casualties. No dead guards who were only doing their jobs, following orders born from a mistake none of them had made. Just precision, patience, and the discipline to let the diversion above do its work. The patrol passed without incident, and the squad split into 2 3-person teams, exactly as planned. Cole led the first toward the detention sector's primary corridor. Anand's team peeled off toward the environmental control room that fed air and power to the cell block, a target that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with what would happen in the next 15 minutes. That was the first turning point of the ground operation. The moment it became clear this was not a straightforward smash and grab, but a mission built in layers, each piece serving a purpose invisible until it clicked into place. Anand's team reached the environmental hub and went to work, not on the life support systems themselves, but on the security override embedded within them, a vulnerability identified months earlier by intelligence analysts who had studied captured Conclave hardware with an obsession that bordered on reverence. Within 90 seconds, the detention sector's internal sensor grid began reporting a cascading series of false readings. Guard patrol positions blurring, motion alerts drowning in static, camera feeds looping footage from hours earlier. It wasn't a full blackout that would have triggered an immediate hard lockdown and flooded the sector with reinforcements. It was something subtler, confusion, just enough to buy the rescue team the gaps they needed. Cole's team reached the outer door of the detention block 4 minutes later. The guard stationed there were arguing with each other over conflicting readouts. Distracted enough that the team took them down without a shot fired. Zip restraints and control falls instead of blaster fire. Each guard left breathing, unconscious, and utterly unharmed. Inside, the cells were exactly where the intelligence reports had placed them, and Cole felt something tighten his chest as he keyed open the first door and saw a woman in a torn survey uniform flinch back against the far wall, eyes wide with 8 months of fear and uncertainty. "Dr. Marrez?" he asked, voice deliberately gentle. "We're United Terran Forces. We're here to take you home." For a moment, she didn't move, didn't seem to believe it. Then something in her face broke open, and she was crossing the cell toward him before he'd even finished the sentence. That was a second turning point. The moment the mission stopped being an abstract objective and became 16 more faces just like hers, each one carrying 8 months of believing no one was coming, each one about to learn they had been wrong. The extraction moved fast after that. Cell by cell, the team worked down the corridor, and one by one the 17 humans, scientists, translators, the 2 Marines who'd been guarding the original survey shuttle, fell in behind them, moving in the tight, disciplined line the team had drilled them into within seconds of contact. No time for reunions yet. No time for anything but the exit. They were 4 cells from finish when the third turning point arrived, and it arrived badly. A junior conclave officer, sharper or luckier than his colleagues, noticed a pattern in the false sensor data, the specific, too convenient rhythm of the interference, and sounded a manual alarm that no amount of digital sabotage could silence. Klaxons blared through the detention sector. Down the corridor, heavy footsteps announced a full security response, dozens of guards converging from both directions, cutting off the route Anand's team had mapped as the primary extraction path. Cole keyed his comm, voice flat and controlled even as his pulse spiked. "Anand, primary route is compromised. We need another way out, and we need it now." There was a pause, 1 beat too long, and then Anand's voice returned tight but steady. "Working on it. There's a service shaft 2 decks down. That isn't on any current map. It's a risk, but it's the only door left. 17 rescued lives. 6 operators. 1 collapsing timeline. And now, a path that existed only as a rumor buried in decades-old station schematics. The last thread standing between success and a fortress full of soldiers closing in from every side. Cole looked at the frightened, hopeful faces behind him and made his choice in less than a second. "Take it," he said. "We're not losing anyone today." The alarm was sounding. The exits were closing. And somewhere above, Captain Voss made a decision that would either save everyone or cost of the ship. The unmapped service shaft dropped through Orin substructure like a wound, narrow and lightless except for the beam of Cole's headlamp cutting through decades of undisturbed dust. Behind him, 17 civilians and 2 more soldiers moved in careful, single-file silence, boots ringing softly on maintenance rungs that hadn't felt weight in a generation. Above them, the muffled thunder of a mobilizing garrison grew louder with every passing minute. On the bridge, Admiral Frex Kale watched the tactical display with a fury that curdled into something closer to disbelief. "How?" he demanded. "Does a fortress this size not have complete maps of its own infrastructure?" No one answered, because no one had a good answer. Orin had been expanded, patched, and rebuilt across 11,000 years by 47 different civilizations, each contributing its own construction standards, its own undocumented shortcuts, its own forgotten access points. The station's greatest strength, its vast, ancient complexity, had just become its greatest vulnerability, and the 6 humans moving through its bones understood that better than the people who had lived there for generations. That was the first turning point of Part 4. The fortress's own history, its patchwork of alliances and half-recorded engineering, had become the exact weakness the rescue plan was built to exploit. Threx redirected every available unit toward the shaft's known exit points. A dozen possible egress corridors scattered across 3 decks, forcing his forces to spread thin, trying to cover them all. It was, in a strange way, the correct response. And it was also exactly what Elena Voss, watching from the Last Promise's tactical station with the calm of someone who had gamed out this exact contingency weeks in advance, had been counting on. "They're splitting their garrison," she said quietly to her XO, a broad-shouldered man named Tomas Ferreira, who had flown with her since the war that had first taught humanity how much it could lose. "Good. That's exactly what we want. And if Cole's team gets pinned before they reach any of the exits?" Ferreira asked. Voss's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the weight she carried. "Then we go get them ourselves." It was not an idle promise. The Last Promise, still holding position at the edge of Orin's defensive envelope, weapons still dark, had spent the last 20 minutes doing something none of the watching Conclave officers had understood. Quietly repositioning, drifting with agonizing slowness toward a specific docking gantry on the fortress's underside. A gantry connected, according to the same forgotten schematics Anand's team was now navigating, to the very shaft the rescue team was descending. It was a risk that bordered on reckless. A single ship, sitting nearly stationary within range of Orin's heaviest batteries, its shields the only thing standing between it and annihilation if the Conclave decided diplomacy was over. But Voss had read the numbers 100 times over. The Last Promise's shields could absorb a punishing amount of fire before failing, and every second the fortress spent deciding whether to escalate to open war over 17 civilians was a second her people didn't have to fight their way through open ground. The second turning point came when the rescue team, 60 meters from the gantry access point, ran directly into a security detachment that had anticipated exactly this route. 12 armed guards, alerted not by luck, but by a commanding officer who had, at last, correctly guessed the shape of the human plan. Cole's team took cover behind a support column. Civilians pressed low against the deck, and for the first time since the mission began, the outcome hung genuinely uncertain in the balance. 12 against 3 operators, in a corridor with no other way out, no reinforcements possible in time. "Anand," Cole said quietly, "tell me you've got something." "Negative on tactical options," she replied. "But I've got a message coming through from the ship. Priority override." Voss's voice crackled into every helmet on the team, calm and absolute. "Cole, hold position. Do not engage. I'm sending you a door." Nobody understood what that meant until, for seconds later, the bulkhead directly behind a Conclave guard attachment tore open in a controlled burst of superheated gas. Not an explosion meant to kill, but precisely calculated environmental discharge, venting a section of unused cargo space the guards hadn't realized was directly behind them, filling the corridor with blinding vapor and deafening alarms that scattered their formation in pure startled confusion. It was a Last Promise, docked now at the gantry above, using its own engineering systems to reach through the fortress's infrastructure, and by 6 seconds of chaos. 6 seconds that Cole's team used to move. They reached the gantry access hatch as the vapor cleared behind them, the disoriented guards only now realizing their quarry had slipped past. Cole hit the hatch controls, and it hissed open onto the Last Promise's boarding ramp. Ferreira standing at the threshold with a weapon raised and a look of fierce relief on his face. 17 and 6, Cole called out, voice hoarse with adrenaline. "Everyone's alive. Everyone's here." But even as the last civilian stumbled up the ramp, the third turning point arrived, and it arrived as an order transmitted across every Conclave channel simultaneously, issued by a counselor far above Threx's authority. Tired of half measures and humiliation, full engagement authorized. Destroy the human vessel before it can leave dock. Aboard the Last Promise, Voss heard the order relayed by her own intercept systems, and for the first time since the mission began, her calm expression tightened into something harder. "Ferreira," she said, already moving toward the bridge. "Get everyone strapped in. We're about to find out exactly how much this ship can take." Every gun on the fortress turned toward one ship. 17 people were finally safe aboard, and now the Last Promise had survived long enough to bring them home. The moment the order to fire reached Orin's weapons batteries, the fortress that had spent 11,000 years never needing to prove its strength unleashed nearly all of it at once. Dozens of particle cannons swung toward the gantry where the last Promise still sat docked, and for 3 agonizing seconds, Elena Voss watched the targeting locks bloom red across her tactical display and understood, with total clarity, that the next choice she made would decide whether this mission ended in triumph or tragedy. "Emergency undock now," she ordered, and Ferreira's hands were already moving before the words finished leaving her mouth. The last Promise tore free of the gantry in a shower of sparks and severed docking clamps, its inertial dampeners screaming under the strain as the ship's aging engines pushed harder than they had in years. Behind them, the first volley of conclave fire tore through the space the ship had occupied half a second earlier, vaporizing the gantry itself in a silent flash of superheated plasma. In the crew compartment below, the 17 rescued civilians braced against crash restraints, some crying, some simply staring in stunned silence at the 6 soldiers who had come for them, at the ship shuddering around them as the first turning point of the final act unfolded in real time. They had made out of the fortress, but they were nowhere close to being safe. "Shields at 80%, Ferreira called out, voice clipped with the discipline of long practice even as the ship rocked from a glancing hit. "They're not holding back." Voss's hands moved across the console with the fluid certainty of someone who had flown through worse. "They don't need to hold back. They need to hit us. There's a difference." She pulled the ship into a hard roll, threading between 2 conclave interceptor squadrons that had scrambled to block the last Promise's escape vector, using the fortress's own defensive superstructure as cover, forcing the pursuing ships to break formation or risk friendly fire against their own station. It was not a battle the last Promise could win through firepower. Everyone aboard knew that. A single Terran vessel, however modified, however skillfully flown, could not outgun an entire fortress garrison. What it could do, what Voss had built her entire career on doing, was refuse to fight the battle on the fortress's terms at all. The second turning point came 90 seconds later, when Threxcale, watching his interceptor formations fail again and again to pin the fleeing ship, made a decision that would be studied and argued over in military academies for decades afterward. He ordered Orin's main battery, a weapon powerful enough to crack a moon, never before fired at a target smaller than a capital warship, to charge for a single, decisive shot. "Admiral," Sarah said, alarm cutting through her usual composure, "that weapon's blast radius will extend past our own interceptor formation. We'll be firing on our own ships." "Then order them clear," Freck snapped, and something in his voice had gone past reason, past doctrine, into raw, wounded pride. "I want that ship destroyed." Voss heard the order relayed through the same intercepted channels that had guided her through the entire mission, and for the first time, real fear flickered behind her calm expression. Not for herself, but for the 17 people and 6 soldiers who had trusted her to bring them home. "Main battery charging," Ferreira confirmed, voice tight. 90 seconds to firing solution. 90 seconds was not enough time to reach a safe hyperspace jump distance. Every calculation said so. Voss ran the numbers twice more anyway, some stubborn part of her refusing to accept an answer she hadn't personally verified 3 times over, and found, buried in the margins of possibility, one option so narrow it bordered on madness. A jump calculated not from a position of safety, but from the fortress's own sense of blind spot, a gap in Orin's coverage created, she realized with something between horror and grim admiration, by the very interceptor wing Threx had just ordered to clear the battery's firing line. "Ferreira, new heading," she said, voice steady even as her pulse hammered. "We're not running from a battery. We're running under it." It was by any reasonable standard an insane maneuver, threading the last Promise directly beneath the main battery's targeting cone, close enough that the weapon's own safety interlocks would refuse to fire for fear of catastrophic backscatter against the fortress's own hull. It was a kind of maneuver that worked exactly once, if it worked at all, and only for a crew that trusted their captain with the full and total certainty of people who had flown beside her through worse. The third turning point of Part 5 arrived in the 11 seconds it took the last Promise to cross beneath Orin's main battery housing, close enough that battle-scarred plating scraped audible sparks along the ship's dorsal hull, close enough that every person aboard could hear the battery's targeting systems screaming abort warnings through the hull itself. Then they were past it, Main battery falling silent behind them exactly as Voss had calculated. The fortress's own weapon rendered useless by its own safety protocols, and open space, clean, dark, empty space, opened up ahead of the last promise like a door finally swinging free. "Clear for jump," Ferreira called out, disbelief and relief warring in his voice. Voss allowed herself one breath, one single unguarded breath, and looked back at the crew compartment readout, at 17 heartbeats steady and alive, at 6 soldiers who had done everything asked of them and more. "Then let's go home," she said, and pulled the lever that folded space around the last promise, vanishing from Fortress Orin sensors in a silent flash of light that Admiral Threx Kale would spend the rest of his career trying to understand. The ship was gone. The mission was over. And 47 civilizations were left staring at the wreckage of everything they thought they knew about humanity. Silence fell across Fortress Orin's bridge in the seconds after the last promise vanished into hyperspace, a silence heavier than any Threx Kale had experienced in 30 years of command. On the tactical display, the space where the human ship had been simply sat empty, a null point where an entire garrison's worth of firepower had failed to stop a single vessel from doing exactly what it came to do. "Status report," Threx said finally, his voice hollow. Sarah ILM didn't look up from her console for a long moment. When she did, her expression carried something he hadn't seen in her before. Not fear exactly, and not admiration either, but kind of unsettled recalculation, as though an entire framework of assumptions had just been quietly and permanently rewritten. "All 17 detainees confirmed extracted," she said. "No fortress fatalities. Minimal structural damage, mostly self-inflicted from main battery backscatter." She paused. "Admiral, they didn't fire a single offensive shot the entire engagement. Not one." That was the first turning point of the final act, and it landed harder than any weapon the last promise could have carried. The Conclave had thrown interceptors, a boarding response, and finally the single most destructive weapon in Orin's arsenal at one small human ship. And that ship had responded to every escalation not with violence, but with precision engineering, patient timing, and a refusal to take a single life it didn't absolutely have to take. They had come for 17 people, and they had left with exactly 17 people, nothing more and nothing less, having spent the entire engagement demonstrating a restraint that made the fortress's overwhelming force look, in hindsight, almost embarrassing. Word spread to the Conclave's command network within hours, and the reaction was not what Threx expected. He had braced for outrage, for calls to mobilize a punitive fleet against Terran space, for the kind of furious escalation that answered humiliation with violence. Instead, what spread through 47 civilizations' worth of military and diplomatic channels was something closer to unease, a quiet, spreading recognition that humanity had just demonstrated a capability none of the Conclave's war colleges had ever properly modeled. That was a second turning point, the moment the story stopped being about one battle and became a referendum on everything the galaxy thought it understood about the newest species in its midst. The Velk ambassador, ancient and rarely given a strong statement, addressed a full Conclave council 3 days later in words that will be quoted for a generation. "We have spent 2 centuries measuring humanity by the size of their fleets, the reach of their borders, the count of their worlds," she said. "We measured wrong. A single ship, crewed by 6 soldiers, accomplished what our doctrine said should have required a war fleet. Not through superior weapons, but through the simple, terrifying fact that they were willing to risk everything for 17 people whose names most of their own government could not have told you a year ago. That is not a weakness to exploit. That is a strength we have no equivalent for, and we would do well to understand it before we ever again mistake their restraint for an absence of resolve." Aboard the last promise, 3 days out from Orin, and safely within Terran space, the mood was quieter, less concerned with what the galaxy would say, and far more concerned with 17 people finally, truly understanding they were home. Dr. Amara Reyes sat in the ship's small mess hall, hands wrapped around a cup of real coffee for the first time in 8 months, watching Elena Voss move through the compartment checking on her crew and her rescued passengers alike with the same careful attention. "Why did you come alone?" Reyes asked when Voss finally sat across from her. "One ship. Against all of that. You could have brought a fleet, forced a real negotiation." Voss considered the question for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried the same quiet certainty that had guided every second of the mission. A fleet starts a war. A war gets people killed, some of them people we came to save. One ship, flown right, doesn't have to fight the whole fortress. It just has to be smarter than it, patient enough to wait for the right gaps, and willing to accept the risk so 17 people don't have to. She paused, something softer crossing her expression. Command asked me the same thing before we launched. I told him the same answer. I'll tell you now. The size of the force was never the point. The 17 people were the point. Everything else was just the way we got to them. That was the third and final turning point. Quieter than the battle itself, but no less important. The revelation that the entire impossible mission had never been built around the idea of overpowering the Conclave, but around a far simpler, far harder principle that had guided every choice from the first moment the last promise left Terran space. That no cost was too high, no mission too improbable, if it meant bringing their own people home. In the years that followed, the story of Fortress Orin spread far beyond the borders of the Conclave, retold and reshaped by a dozen different cultures, each finding in it a different lesson. Military historians studied Voss's tactics in academies across 47 worlds. Diplomats cited the encounter as the moment Conclave policy toward Terran space shifted from cautious tolerance to something closer to wary respect. And on Earth, where the mission remained classified for years before the details finally became public, the story became something simpler and more enduring than any tactical analysis could capture: a quiet, unshakable promise repeated in briefing rooms and recruitment posters, and the private thoughts of every soldier who ever wore the uniform. No human gets left behind. Not for glory, not for conquest, not even for the satisfaction of proving a point to a galaxy that had never quite known what to make of them, just because it was true, and because 17 people once had needed it to be.